The Ta language, also known as Xho, is a language spoken on the border of Botswana and Namibia, and it is famous for perhaps the most absurd phonemic inventory in the world. With counts of between 80 to 160 consonants, many of which are click sounds, such as the and approximately 30 vowels and 2 to 4 tones, the Xho language is a true testament to the magic that is human communication. Before we get into it, here is a short clip of what the language actually sounds like. In this video, we will talk about the Xho language in terms of classification, touching a tiny bit on the culture of the people who speak it. Then we'll move on to talk about the main reason I wanted to make this video, which is the insane sound inventory of the language. And we'll conclude with briefly discussing some interesting aspects of the grammar and a little bit on the main researcher who spent decades of his life studying this wonderful language. So without further ado, let's get started. First off, classification. Where does Xho come from and where is it spoken? Back in the day, linguist Joseph Greenberg tried to categorize all African languages into a few macro language families, one of which being the Khoisan language family. Today, Khoisan as a language family is widely rejected as a linguistic classification, but the term is still used today as a term of convenience, mostly just to demonstrate the geographical distribution of the languages that have click consonants but do not belong to other African language families. Here we can see in yellow the general areas of where Khoisan languages are spoken. Important side note, however, just because two languages have similar sounds, even if they're as exotic and as rare as click consonants, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're immediately related to each other. Grammar and genealogical relationships also have to be considered when classifying language families. Which is exactly why, today, the former Khoisan languages are divided into three main language families. The Khoikwadi, K'a, and Tu'u, all spoken in and around southwestern-ish Africa, as well as an additional two language isolates, Sandawe and Hadza, spoken in Tanzania. The topic of today's video, the Xho language and its dialects, are pretty much the last surviving members of the Tu'u language family. There's another live one called but as of 2021, from what I could find, there's only really one last surviving native speaker. So, unfortunately, it's probably going to be gone very soon, leaving only Xho and its dialects. While we're on the topic, I should mention that there are a bunch of other languages that have click consonants that were never classified as Khoisan. These are the most famous southern Bantu languages that you've probably heard of, such as Zulu, Xhosa, Ndebele, Swazi, and a bunch of others. There's also a South Cushitic language called Dahalo, spoken in Kenya, which has a few clicks here and there, but they're relatively rare in that language. And then there's also Damin, which is an extinct ceremonial language of the Lardilan Yankal people of northern Australia, which was the only language with click consonants in the world outside of Africa, until it went extinct, that is. And it's just such a story for another time. I can't keep getting off topic. Back to Xho. So when it comes to people, those who speak Xho belong to a broadly defined ethnic group known as the San peoples, also known as Basarwa, also known as the Bushmen. Altogether, these are people who speak Khoikwadi, K'a, and Tu'u languages mentioned previously, and most of them are hunter-gatherer societies, speculated to be some of the oldest surviving cultures in the world. Those people don't really have a collective word for the entire group, and don't think of themselves as a unified people, but are rather divided into various clans and nations. The terms San, Basarwa, and Bushmen are generalizations, and nowadays are seen as derogatory, and the people themselves would prefer it if you refer to them by their individual nations rather than grouping them all together. I'm assuming that it's the same in the case of the Xho specifically, but keyword here is assuming. I couldn't really tell you because there's really not much information I could find on the individual societies separated by linguistic boundaries. All of the studies and articles that I've read in preparation for this video focus on the linguistics of the language rather than on the anthropology and sociology of the people groups, and only really reference the collective Bushmen. So, Either way, these people are oftentimes involved in hunting wild game as well as foraging food. They use spears as well as bows and arrows, sometimes with poison gathered from beetle larvae. Leisure is very important in these societies, and they have a lot of very complex ritual dances, music, games, cave paintings, and a myriad of cultural activities, which you would have to learn if you ever wanted to become fluent in the language. Can't be fluent in the language without being fluent in the culture. Even though men and women do have different roles in society, when it comes to decision making, most of the tribes seem to have relative equality between the genders. Certain tribes have chiefs, usually a man, but a woman may also be the leader of her family group, and both sides are taken into account. These are all very basic things from the lives of the people of the region, including those who speak Xoon. But again, I want to emphasize that it heavily varies from community to community, and there's a whole lot more that goes into it beyond what I just said. In any case, let's move on to the linguistics of the language. First of all, phonetics and phonology, which in my eyes are the coolest aspects of this language. So when it comes to vowels, there are 5 basic vowels. A, E, I, O, U. However, there are also 5 phonation types per vowel. Phonation basically refers to how much you constrict your vocal cords and how much they vibrate when producing a certain speech sound, which modifies the airstream, which leads to a difference in how a sound sounds. The 5 phonation types in Xoon are modal voice, glottalized, breathy voice, pharyngealized, and strident. I will now try to demonstrate the difference of how these sound. Probably not super accurately, but bear with me. A, O, Ha, O, Ah. Something along those lines. Additionally, there's the nasalization of vowels, which is when a little bit of air escapes through your nose as well. So like the difference between ah and ah, all of this brings the total number of distinct vowels to approximately 30. I say approximately because there is still variation between certain dialects, and there's a whole lot more that goes into it, like phonotactic restrictions, syllable onset, the context, etc. In the introduction, I also mentioned that there are between 2 and 4 tones. Thing is, some studies from the 70s, 80s, and 90s claim 4 tones, while other, more recent studies claim to have re-examined this and that there are only actually 2 tones. The reason for this discrepancy has to do with morai, which is a unit of time equal to or shorter than a syllable, and the way that syllables work in Xoon. Tones are a component of grammar, meaning they influence agreement between nouns and verbs and the like. And so what they did is they basically took a bunch of different phrases and examined how the pitch contours vary, and the conclusion they came to is that it's likely just 2 tones that have variation in length and intonation in certain cases, but it's not really 4 distinct tones. In any case, there's a really good paper on this by Christfried Naumann, and I highly recommend you check it out, link in the description. The bottom line is that tones are really cool, and languages that have a crazy amount of vowels and consonants that also have tones are even cooler just because of how difficult it would be to learn this. Personally, the way I look at language is more difficult / more unusual equals more awesome. And I have a hard time not talking about it to everyone, which is exactly why I make these videos. But anyway, speaking of consonants, let's talk about them. In the beginning, I said that there are between 80 to 160 consonants. For reference, Standard British English has 24 consonants. So, how is this possible, and what is with this crazy difference in counting them? In order to understand this, we first need to understand the types of consonants that Xoon has. By the way, there are 2 main dialect clusters in Xoon, Eastern and Western, which have slightly different counts of phonemes, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll be showing you specifically the Western dialect. Still, like 95% of the stuff that I'm about to say applies to both of them, but just know that the IPA chart that I'll be referencing at the very end of the section applies to the Western dialect in particular. Xoon has 3 types of consonants. In other words, it utilizes 3 airstream mechanisms to produce consonants. Pulmonic egressive, which are the sounds that we're all used to. Every single language in the world has these. These are consonants exactly like you think of them. You know, consonants. Egressive basically means breathing out. We breathe out when producing these sounds. The second type is glottalic egressive, also known as ejectives. These are rarer across the world, and English doesn't really have them, but they still shouldn't be too difficult to pronounce. As the name ejective suggests, we basically eject our regular consonants with a bit more oomph than usual. So for example, regular t, ejective t, regular p, ejective p, regular k, ejective k, and so on. And the third type of consonants is lingual/velar ingressive, also known as click consonants. While aggressive means breathing out, ingressive means breathing in. We breathe in when producing these sounds. Now, there are 5 basic click consonants in Xoon, and I'll start with the ones that most English speakers should at least be familiar with. The dental click, which is like when you disapprove of something that your kid did. Then there's the lateral click, which is how you would like call a horse. Next, the alveolar click, which is how some people imitate a horse running or a clock ticking. We used to pretend to play ping pong like this in school. The fourth type is the palatal click, which sounds very similar to the dental click, but it's different. Instead of having your tongue touch the front of your mouth and your teeth, you sort of just push your tongue flat against the roof of your mouth. And the final type is the bilabial click, which is basically just having your lips kind of touch off of each other. Keep in mind, there are a few other types of clicks out there in other languages, but these are the 5 basic types of clicks present in the Xoon language. By the way, apparently about 70% of all words in the dictionary start with a click. That is one of the coolest and most mind-blowing facts I have read all day. Anyway, I know that was a ton of information, but now you should have an understanding of all the different basic types of consonants that this language has. But don't worry, because it's way more complicated than that. Additionally, consonants may have a few other properties that would make them different from your basic types. In other words, that would turn them into different phonemes able to change the meaning of a word or a sentence. There are a few other things that I think are important to define before we carry on. Aspiration is when a burst of breath accompanies a consonant either before or after. So, for example, k and k, tak, 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 tak. Nasalization, which we already talked about in terms of vowels, and it's pretty similar in terms of consonants, but it's when a little bit of air escapes through your nose when producing a sound. And voiced versus voiceless. This has to do with the vocal cords vibrating during the production of a consonant. Try touching your throat here and saying S and Z and then compare. S, Z, S, Z. That's how you distinguish between voiced and voiceless consonants. P, 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 b, 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 t, 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 d, 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 k, 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 g, 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 and so on. The vocal cords don't vibrate when you say S, so the S is voiceless. The vocal cords vibrate when you say Z, so the Z is voiced. And now let's have a look at the full IPA chart of the consonants of Xoon so you can more easily visualize how all of this is structured, and I'll try to walk you through it. Right, so first of all, I have highlighted all the boxes that include your regular pulmonic egressive consonants that all of us know and love. Next, here are the regular ejectives, which we might not know and love very well, but they shouldn't be that alien for us to use. And lastly, here are the clicks. Now, if you'll notice, there are a whole lot more than just 5, like we discussed earlier. Actually, 43 to be exact. Now, if you're like me, your first question should be, what the hell? Here are the plain ordinary ones which we discussed. Turns out, in this language, clicks are also able to be voiced. They can be aspirated, both voiced and voiceless. You can have a click that is also an ejective, that is also either voiced or voiceless. Clicks can also be nasalized, voiced and voiceless. I didn't think that was possible, but okay. And they can be glottalized. Altogether, this chart shows a grand total of 87 consonants altogether. Isn't this just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? And guess what? We're still not done yet. I just showed you 87 consonants, but what about the other 80 to get to the 160 number mentioned in the beginning? Well, this is where we enter cluster territory. Because 87 consonants is obviously too little, speakers of Xoon decided to just jumble a bunch of them together, creating consonant clusters. Let me present you with a separate IPA chart which illustrates those clusters. We're not going to spend too much time on this because my Indo-European brain is starting to get overloaded and refuses to believe that humans actually speak like this. But anyway, let's look at a few examples. You got the easy ones here, like this one, which is basically just a T and Ch together, so tch, tch, tcha. Or the dzch, which is just basically dzch, dzch, dzcha. But the vast majority are absolutely ridiculous. Look at this thing, for example. A voiced lateral click combined with a uvular affricate voiceless ejective. I can't even begin to imagine how in the world that's possible to pronounce, but I'm gonna try. My god. Or let's try this one, for example. A nasalized voiceless bilabial click combined with an aspirated H. Is that is that double aspiration? I don't know. But let's see here. Buh, 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 buh. In any case, there are a total of 77 of them in this chart. Now, because consonant clusters are not basic consonants on their own, you can see how the total count of consonants can be so varied over decades of research, especially since for a lot of these, it's impossible to hear the difference for the untrained ear, especially when you're recording a native speaker speaking at normal speed and you, as a researcher, don't speak the language. You have to analyze this stuff under a microscope to be able to hear the difference between some of the phonemes. Consonant clusters, more like cluster headaches, am I right? Now, let's summarize. With 87 consonants, 43 of which are clicks, and 77 consonant clusters, most of which also include a click, according to this paper by Christfried Naumann, which itself is a summary of a ton of different studies spanning decades, if you wanted to make the title of this video as clickbaity as possible and count consonant clusters as separate consonants, that's how you get to the number of 164 consonants in the Xoon language. If you ask me personally, I think we should keep consonants and consonant clusters separate, but even then, 87 consonants not counting the clusters. I don't think there has ever been or ever will be another natural human language that reaches this level of phonemic and phonological insanity. Nobody even comes close. There is the age-old famous question, which language is the most difficult in the world? I've always hated this question. It's such a stupid question because the answer is always, it depends. It depends on what your native language is. Also difficult in what way? Grammar? Pronunciation? Writing system? It's almost not worth thinking about. However, if I absolutely had to pick one language as a candidate for that title, at least specifically in the pronunciation category, I would definitely pick Xoon. Okay, moving on. Now let's briefly, and I mean very briefly, talk about the grammar and some interesting stuff that I've read about it. Sounds are fun and all, but how do the sentences work? In this part, we will have to touch a little bit on the dialects because it does differ depending on the dialect. But first, we'll talk in general terms, and then I'll be showing you some examples where I'll actually be saying these sentences. Apologies for the pronunciation, but come on, let's be honest here. It's not like you have any reference as to how it's actually supposed to sound like, or like you're gonna find anyone else trying to pronounce this crazy stuff. I love trying to pronounce weird languages when I have no idea what's going on. Obviously, I try to practice, and I do try to make it at least a little bit accurate. I guess you're just stuck with me. So, first of all, the general word order is subject, verb, object, much like in English. What's not like in English is a rather unusual feature that is described as verbal cross-reference is rather of the object than of the subject. Let's do an example. Here are two sentences. The first one, nsi, ae, are, chae, ue means I see one big sheep. The second sentence, nsi, an, cham an means I see big sheep, as in a few big sheep. The verb here is to see, which is na. In the first sentence, because we're talking about one sheep, the ending is e. In the second sentence, because we're talking about multiple sheep, the verb ending changes from e to an. And the adjectives and numbers that follow the noun also have the same ending as the verb. Obviously, the nouns a sheep and sheep are different, one's singular, one's plural, but to me, the unusual part here is that the verb changes. Like in English, when we say I see a sheep and I see multiple sheep, we're still doing the same action. We're still just seeing. We're seeing different things, but the action is still the same. So why would the verb change, you know? So that's an interesting little quirk, I think. Next, let's talk about genders, or grammatical categories. This, I think, would probably be the most difficult part about learning the grammar, because they seem to work in a very arbitrary way. In most languages, usually, you can sort of tell what grammatical category a noun will belong to based on either on what it sounds like or what it is. Some languages with a lot of grammatical categories usually categorize stuff into human stuff, animals, plants, vessels, abstract stuff, spiritual stuff, and so on. And while of course it does take a lot of practice and learning about the culture to be able to fully grasp it, usually it should be more or less obvious what category a noun should belong to. In Xoon, that doesn't seem to be the case. According to Roland Kießling in his paper on noun classification, he writes, "The assignment of a noun to a certain gender is often not directly recoverable, neither from its meaning nor its form. This could be seen in 3 sets of nouns with nearly the same form, in particular with the same vowel in the second mora, but assigned to different genders, and 3 sets of nouns belonging to the same semantic domain, including a case of synonymy, but assigned to different genders." Basically, this is going to take a whole lot of trial and error and memorization. The Western dialect has about 6 or 7 genders, while the Eastern dialect seems to have at least 9. And here are just a few examples of what general categories there are. The first one, mass nouns and substances. Okay, so far so good. The second, artifacts and tools, including miscellaneous animals and plants, body parts, insects, disease, atmosphere and environment, reptiles, containers, and humans. The third one, excretions associated with body parts, offspring, parts of plants, animals, spatial relations, etc. Fourth one, place names, personal names, nouns of quality, animals, amorphous entities without inherent shape, such as liquids and body fluids. Then there's some other categories where a whole bunch of random stuff overlaps, and it heavily depends on the context of when you're speaking, and honestly, it's just a complete mess, at least to my Indo-European brain. If you'd like to see a full list of how approximately all of this works, I highly recommend you check out Roland Kießling's paper, the link of which is going to be in the description below. And of course, this gets even more complicated when comparing different dialects. Here are 2 sentences from the Western dialect. The first one, tu'u n'si a'u, which means it's people, I see them. And the second phrase, hare n'si a'an, which means it's dogs, I see them. So again, the verb is to see, and in the first sentence, the ending is u, a'u, which corresponds to the grammatical category that the word for people is in. While in the second phrase, the ending changes to an, because the word for dogs is in a different grammatical category, so it will be different from people. However, when we look at the same phrase in the Eastern dialect, you'll notice something is different. So the same 2 sentences in the Eastern dialect, the first being tu'u na nma u'u, it's people, I see them, and the second phrase abate nma u'u, it's dogs, I see them. The first phrase, it's people, I see them, is almost the same, when the ending being u, a'u, which corresponds to the grammatical category of people. However, the second phrase, it's dogs, I see them, instead of having a different ending, The ending is still exactly the same as in the first sentence. A'u. Turns out, in the Eastern dialect, people and dogs are of the same gender, or of the same grammatical category. So the ending would be the same for both of them, which is really cool, but really confusing. Anyway, I know I keep saying this over and over again, but there's a whole lot more that goes into it. It's incredibly complex, and I'm probably not qualified to be talking about this to begin with. So please do check out the actual studies in the video description. And this is where we begin to reach the conclusion of today's video. There have been a lot of people working tirelessly over the years to try and document, analyze, and understand this exotic language and the people who speak it. However, there is one particular person without whom none of it would be possible. A South African linguist by the name of Anthony Traill. He went on nearly 100 expeditions over 35 years to try and document the Xoon language. He published countless papers on it, including the dictionary. Apart from English and Xoon, he also spoke Zulu, Tsonga, Setswana, and Afrikaans, which is so cool. Additionally, I also read this about him. Traill developed a lump on his larynx after speaking the language for a long time, which is typical of adult native Xoon speakers, but not children, a testament to his time spent with the language. That sounded almost unbelievable to me, like, come on. But after a bit of Googling and seeing the same fact pop up multiple times in multiple different articles, including a scientific study, turns out it's probably true. Speaking this language isn't just insane from a phonological standpoint, but it quite literally takes a physical toll on your body. You develop a lump on your larynx from speaking it. That is madness, and is also so damn cool, and also like pretty metal if you ask me. Before we finish up the video, I would like to read you a paragraph from the acknowledgement section of the dictionary written by Anthony Traill. I think it perfectly illustrates what it takes for a project such as this to be a person's life's work, as well as how incredibly humble he was. And as a linguist myself, this is kind of what I aspire to be like, and the experience that I hope to one day have. I owe my greatest debt to all the Xoon who have patiently taught me their language and instructed me in many aspects of their culture. They have been expert and inspiring teachers who have led me enthusiastically into their linguistic, physical, and mental worlds. They will never know how compellingly fascinating this education has been for me. I have learned most from Borokkhao, who has grown older with me through 23 years of field work. He has been, as he would say, the head teacher of an unconventional school. He has been a brilliant teacher with a wonderful sense of humor and an uncanny understanding of the limits of the Western mind. He goes on to thank many more people and listing every way that all of them helped in the creation of the dictionary. And honestly, it's quite touching to read. And it's just such an enormous accomplishment. If you come from a community that speaks an endangered language, please keep speaking it, keep living it, and pass it on to the next generation. Because in the vast majority of cases, once it's gone forever. And if you're simply interested in learning a language, any language at all, even Xoon, just go for it, just do it. Remember, there's no such thing as a useless language, and anyone who tells you otherwise is wrong, and you shouldn't listen to them. If you made it this far, I want to thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. I wish you a great day and a wonderful night, and now enjoy an outro of me reading a story in Xoon. Ka ai an Borokkhao an wasakai an isukay kutalute tukneo ngomate ki dautsay ku. Ukay kaba nente nguma ikne ngasa ikobe kuknum ki upa te ke eo tsay biknu a ikoa ba nguma nute. Ukay sa kete buklay ba nense a kaisa I o ke tuum ka o ke ne benkele I an ke khabeka I oun I te ku ki zai ke I kaneka ku alutete I ka ba au an iba sa tsenki u a ikatye borkau ke khabeka asa un ite ke kha ku u umatani ikle kabakatye u a ikne a ta alika isa o katani ka u ki an I o ka ansa ie I oa ki zai borkau aite asa ite oa oe bakaneki e ka ki zai ka kun ke abe be o ke la ansa I oa kun asa se enya kanya I ubeku sakai nateba ke oa ku na tuka khoisa ku isaki a ke ngautseo. Good night, everyone.